So hello, everybody in the virtual world and beyond. This is Chief Lavelle with W.A.R Radio. I have a special guest for you today, Dr. Arwin Smallwood. I'm going to turn this over to him. I'm going to let him introduce himself because he can introduce himself much better than I can. And he's going to start after his introduction. He's going to share some information through a slideshow. So, Dr. Smallwood, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that and appreciate the opportunity to speak with your audience. I'm Arwin Smallwood. I am the chair of the Department of History and Political Science at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. And I do research on Eastern North Carolina in the early period, looking at Native Americans, African Americans, but colonial society and changes and what has happened in the early period. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about my primary research area is on the Tuscarora Indians who at one time populated Eastern North Carolina. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the history of the Tuscaroras in North Carolina, how they came to be there, and a little about the impact that they had on the region. And so again, you'll stop me when we're out of time, when we get to the time limit, and I'm going to try to move through these slides pretty quickly and just kind of have that discussion. So, this talk is really going to be about helping people understand the Tuscarora and other native groups that are in Eastern North Carolina prior to European contact, during European contact, and then after European contact. Now, I won't come all the way up to the present day, but I think through this presentation, you will understand, how Native people, African people, and European peoples intermixed and interacted in the early contact period, specifically here in North Carolina, but really throughout the Americas during this early period. I'm going to start this presentation just to talk a little bit about the Native peoples that were here east of the Mississippi River. I mean, there are hundreds of Native Americans in North America alone, between the U.S. and Canada, over 500 nations of Indians in North America alone, what became the United States. And they are broken up into regions. Like we have our Arctic Indians, Eskimos up in the north in Alaska. You have your subarctic Indians in, parts of Canada. And then you have the southeastern Indians and the northeastern Indians, which are who we're going to focus on in this talk. But there are also Great Plains Indians, West Coast Indians, California Indians, Caribbean Indians, etc. So there are different groups of Indians, and within these groups of Indians, there can be, lots of Indians, 20, 30, 40, 50 or more groups of Indians in a particular region or particular area. So we're going to talk about the northeastern Indians because although the Tuscaroras were in North Carolina and people think of North Carolina Indians as being southeastern Indians, the North Carolina Indians, both the Algonquins and the Iroquois, which is what the Tuscarora wore, they are actually northeastern Indians, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So this map shows northeastern Indians and southeastern Indians, and if we were to look at the northeastern Indians, the larger groups of these Indians that were related to Tuscaroras are going to be the Oneidas, the Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, Mohawks, and then although the Delawares and the Powhatans were actually Algonquins, they oftentimes were at different stages in confederation with the Iroquois in the Northeast. And then when we think of the Southeastern Indians, we think of the Cherokee, who were actually Iroquoian people, but they absorbed a lot of the Muskegon people who were Creeks. And, they, for many years, early in the early period, behaved more like the Muskegons than they did Iroquois, but they are culturally connected to the Iroquois. And I'll talk about how that is. And then the Siouan people, the Catawbas, the Yamasees, you have Santee, and then of course Chickasaws of Muskegon, as well as the Choctaw. So, there are many other groups, PDs, there are Coors, there are Hatteras, the Cape Fear, there are other groups of Indians, but I'm just talking about several large groups of Indians that had an impact on other nations of Indians. So if we're talking about those different groups of Indians, And we're talking about them in the context of the territories or lands east of the Mississippi River. As I've already said, you have your Iroquoian groups and you have your Siouan groups and you have Muskegon groups and Algonquins. In North Carolina, you pretty much have three groups. You got Algonquins in eastern North Carolina, stretching down from Richmond, Virginia, which includes the Nottaways and Meharans and the Tuscaroras. And then in North Carolina, you have the Core and the Noose Indians who wrap around towards Hatteras Island, and they are, considered to be Iroquois. But then you have the Hatteras Indians, the Cape Fear Indians, and a number of other South Carolina Indians, and then of course Catawbas. But there are numbers of groups of Indians. And when we think of these groups linguistically, what we need to think about is that the Indian language groups are similar to European language groups. If we were to think about the English and the French and the Dutch, I mean, it's a similar pattern. Different groups of people, could speak a certain language, and oftentimes they understood other languages as well. But those things tended to basically have, help to connect people to one another during this period. So the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Senecas, the Cayugas, and the Tuscaroras who were in North Carolina all spoke the Iroquois language. And I often say to people, it's like with English, you have people in Australia that speak English, you have people in England that speak English, in America that speak English, in the British Islands that speak English, but we have different dialects, different accents. And even in the United States, Southerners speak differently than the folks in New England. The folks in New England speak differently than the Midwesterners. Midwesterners speak differently than folks out on the West Coast in California. So these people can communicate. They speak the Iroquois language, and they basically speak the same language, but there's certain words that might be different, but they can still understand each other and they still communicate with one another. This is just an up close view of the Atlantic seaboard, the Algonquins coming down from Canada and from the New England area down into the Chesapeake, into Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and eventually into eastern North Carolina. And then the Iroquois, primarily the Tuscaroras, Meharans, Nottaways, coming down through Virginia and into eastern North Carolina down to the Cape Fear River, in and near, that region down near Hatteras Island, etc. Um, so the arrival of the Tuscarora, and we call them Iroquois, but the native name for the Tuscaroras and the other members of what became known as the Five and Six Nations is Haudenosaunee. So the Haudenosaunee people, how did the Haudenosaunee people come to be in their homelands, in their areas, and how did the Tuscaroras end up separating from them and ending up in North Carolina and Virginia? And so what I'm going to do now is talk about that and talk about their impact on Algonquins in the Albemarle region, but talk about, how they came to be in North Carolina and Virginia, and then how they basically in the early period have an impact on the other nations of Indians that are around them. The emblem behind this family, this Iroquois or Haudenosaunee family, is the wampum belt that represents the Five Nations. The Tuscaroras don't appear on that original wampum belt, but they have since made a belt, or after they joined them in 1722, they made an official belt, with 6 lines on it to represent the 6 nations. But the smaller square to your right is the Mohawks, who are the keepers of the eastern door. To the west of them, a little larger, is the Oneidas, the people of the Standing Stone. In the center is the in the center is the Onondagas, who are the keepers of the council fire, the triangular shape. To the west of them, the Onondagas, the people of the Mucky Lands, and then to the west of them are the Seneca, who are the keepers of the western door. So you can't, trade or interact with the Confederacy unless you come through the east, through the Mohawks, or come through the west, other Indian nations, through the Senecas, and that's what that belt represents. So when we talk about their arrival into North Carolina, the Tuscaroras, and their relationship with their kinsmen to the north, there's an ancient history with the Tuscaroras and the other members of the Six Nations of the other Iroquoian people. And that ancient history is recounted that they were in the Mississippi River Valley at the ancient city of Cahokia. But then there was some great natural disaster, flood of some sort, that caused the people to disperse, and they moved east. and they dispersed throughout what is western New York State through the Finger Lakes region of New York State. And the first to break off from the Iroquois were the Cherokees. And they broke off and they went south into Tennessee in the extreme southwestern part of North Carolina, but basically into North Georgia, Tennessee, and as I said before, the extreme western part of North Carolina on the border with Georgia and Tennessee. The rest of the five nations moved into the Finger Lakes region of New York, with the Mohawks settling in the east along the Mohawk River. To them, like I said, the Oneidas settling in the Finger Lakes region, and then the Onondagas near Syracuse, New York, and then the Cayugas and the Senecas in the western part of New York State. And at that time, the Tuscaroras splintered off from the rest of the Iroquois and moved south, and they end up settling in North Carolina, coming down the Shenandoah Valley and coming out of the mountains at Roanoke, Virginia, where the source of the Roanoke River is, and following the river out of the mountains down into eastern North Carolina. And once they arrived in eastern North Carolina, they split into the Meharans, the Nottaways, and then what we call and know of as the Tuscaroras proper. If you were to look at this in terms of genetic line and how they all are one, and you see this line coming down, the first to split off are the Cherokees, that's CH. The next to split off are the Tuscaroras, which is one continuous bloodline until the Nottaways split away from them for Nottaways, and the Meharans split away around the same time. But you have basically Nottaways, Tuscaroras, and Meharans are really closely aligned by blood. And then the other Iroquois people splitting off, the Cayugas split off again, and then come back into the bloodlines of the other five nations. The Hurons and the Wyandots are there, but in terms of five nations, we're talking about the Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, and the Mohawks, and then you have the Susquehannas, Susquehannas, who are actually a derivative of the five nations as well. So it's important to understand that these nations are all related by blood. They all spoke the same language or a dialect of the same language. They could understand one another. They confederated with one another, and they supported one another. So to understand North Carolina and native peoples in North Carolina in the early period, you have to understand the Tuscaroras in particular and their relationship with their kinsmen to the north, because they maintained that relationship pretty much from the time they arrived in North Carolina and throughout their time in North Carolina before many of them returned to their kinsmen after the Tuscarora War in 1713. This is the River Valley regions. Again, as I mentioned, the Roanoke River comes down out of the Roanoke River Valley in Roanoke, Virginia. That's the source of the Roanoke River, comes down through the Piedmont of Virginia and flows down, along Bertie County, and then, it empties into the Albemarle Sound. And then as you see, you have the Meharon River, which flows out of the Piedmont of Virginia down into the Chowan River, and it flows into the Albemarle Sound. And then also the Nottaway River, which does the same, coming down out of the Piedmont and then flowing. And again, that's where you see your Nottaways are settled along the Nottaway River in Virginia, the Meharans along the Meharon River in Virginia and North Carolina, and then the Tuscaroras along the Roanoke River. But then they also begin to move south from the Roanoke River, and they settle along the Tar River and also the Neuse River. And then as I said before, the southernmost extent of their empire would be down in the Cape Fear River region. So when you get to the Cape Fear, you're reaching the limits of the areas that were under the influence of the Tuscarora and or their hunting grounds, but they do extend up into the Piedmont as far west as Raleigh, Greensboro, and even when they're pushed out of eastern North Carolina as far west as Winston-Salem. So they have, hunting grounds in areas pretty much from the western part of North Carolina to the eastern part of North Carolina during that particular time period. This is just another view of the Cherokees in Tennessee, North Georgia, Alabama, and the Tuscaroras, in eastern North Carolina, and the Iroquois Confederacy to the north in New York State, and some Iroquois in southern Canada. The thing to remember about the Iroquois and about the Tuscaroras is that they were one of the high civilizations. As I mentioned, there are hundreds of nations of Indians all over the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, in South America, Central America, North America. But when we think of, really highly advanced nations that were well organized and very militaristic, we think of the Incas, we think of the Aztecs, we think of the Mayans, we think of the Northwest Pacific Coast, we think of the Pueblos, and then we have to think of the Iroquois. And then, as I mentioned to many students, they were a democracy. All of the nations, that were there, the 5 nations, 6 nations with Tuscaroras, they elected their chiefs. The clan mothers were the ones who selected the chiefs, but they were a democracy. And so they had a very sophisticated governmental structure, and they had a strong and powerful military that they used to expand their influence throughout the Midwest and in the northeastern woodlands. And then with the Tuscaroras being affiliated with them in Virginia and eastern North Carolina, they had vast influence over many nations of Indians, including the Shawnee and the Delaware, the Miami Indians, even as far west as Peoria, the Peoria Indians in Illinois. But they pretty much, influenced all of the Indians of the Ohio Valley and of Maryland, Virginia, down into eastern North Carolina. This is a drawing of Mohawk Village. You see the Iroquois longhouses in the background, their village, and they were in the New York region. And this is a French map from the 1600s documenting the Iroquois. You see them to the west, those same Iroquois villages throughout New York State. And you can clearly see this is New York State. You can see Massachusetts in the light green. You can see New York, Long Island in the pink. You see New Jersey in the kind of orange. Then you see New Jersey going down to the Chesapeake Bay in green, and then going down to Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. But again, I tell people who are studying Native American history as well, to get a full understanding of Native American history, you will have to look at French records, Spanish records, and English records. When the English came to North America and started interacting with the Iroquois and with the Tuscaroras in North Carolina, the Spanish had already been here for over nearly, if not over 100 years. They had come in 1492. The English didn't get here until 1580s. So almost 100 years, the Spanish had influenced native nations in North America, the Caribbean, and in Central America and South America. And then as the French and the Dutch and the English come, they all, treat with the Indians, document their influence, their power, their militaries, their villages. So there was a great deal that we knew about Native Americans. The English didn't know, and they were learning in the 1600s, but the Spanish and the French already knew. And so they would catch up later to learn some more about them. So there's a lot of documents about Native people in early America prior to the arrival of the English. And then after the English arrive, they add to that body of knowledge. So if we look at eastern North Carolina and we talk about the Tuscaroras being in North Carolina, and we talk about the Algonquin-speaking Indians that were in the coastal regions of North Carolina, these are the groups that would have been there. And I can't really say they would have been there at the time of contact, because there's going to be some change and transformation in Indian nations because of the English arriving and spreading disease and introducing Africans into the region. There's going to be an impact on native coastal Indians, including the Tuscarora, and I'll touch on that a little bit as we move further in. But Indians like the Machapunga Indians, the Bear River Indians, the Mattamuskeet Indians, when you look at the early maps by the English in 1584 and 85, those nations of Indians are not on those maps. They're different nations of Indians. But by the time of the Tuscarora War in 1711, these nations are there. And so we see that there has been a change, and the names of the Indians, have changed. Some stay the same, like Tuscaroras and the Hatteras and Core, but some Indian names will, be different, particularly the Machapunga, the Bear River, and the Mattamuskeet. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But again, a whole host of Indians, the Core, the Noose, the Roanoke, all of these groups of Indians, a mix of Algonquin and Iroquois Indians in eastern North Carolina, in the coastal plains of eastern North Carolina. If we look at the Tuscaroras, who were the most dominant group in eastern North Carolina, who had alliances with many of the Algonquin peoples that were in the region. There were basically 7 major clans. Now, there could have been 1 or 2 more, but the record beginning in the 1600s and 1700s records there were 7 clans. So we have the Snipe clan, Wolf clan, Eel clan, Bear clan, Deer clan, Beaver clan, and Turtle clan. And these clans basically are, they're based on the game that was in the territory that they lived in. And so they took the names of that game. These clans are, the Tuscarora Nation was a female dominated nation. You became a member of your clan because of your mother. You take on the bloodline of your mother. If your mother's a Tuscarora, then you were a Tuscarora by blood. If the father was Mohawk or or Seneca or was a Cherokee or whatever, it didn't matter what the father was, white, black. If the mother was Tuscarora, then the child was Tuscarora. And if she was a mother of the Snipe clan, then the child was born into the Snipe clan. So it's just important to understand that they are a matriarchal society, and most Native Americans in the Eastern Woodlands, the rest of the Iroquois were at that time as well. They were not patriarchal in the sense that you take the names of your fathers. You became a member of the nation through your mother, and you took on the clan of your mother. So just one of the things you want to think about and remember when you're talking about early Native Americans in North Carolina and in what we call the Eastern Woodlands, the Northeastern Woodlands and the Southeastern Woodlands. That, of course, changes because of influences of Europeans. Everyone is altered, everyone's culture, everyone's religion, everything is altered when you have prolonged interaction with the Europeans. But prior to the Europeans is what we're talking about. That was your basic culture among the Northeastern and Southeastern Indians, and specifically amongst the Tuscarora. This map is indicating that most of the Tuscarora villages were in eastern North Carolina, as I said before, between the Nottoway, Meharron, Roanoke rivers, Tar, Neuse, and down to the Cape Fear River. They had, easy access to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Even though there were Algonquins living in that region, those Algonquins did not, wage war with the Tuscaroras or have conflict with the Tuscaroras. They moved into the region at will to scour the beaches of the Outer Banks, Nag's Head, and the other beaches of the Outer Banks for seashells. And they were looking for a particular seashell that they used to trade with the Six Nations to the north and with other Indian nations. And because of where they were situated in eastern North Carolina and their hunting grounds and territories going up into the Piedmont, they had access to and control of major trade routes to the north, as far north as New York, with their kinsmen, the Six Nations, and even as far south and west as parts of Kentucky and even North Georgia and East Tennessee. So they were known as a trading nation. They were known as trading people. And seashells, I mean, we may say, well, what with seashells? I mean, there's all kinds of seashells out on the coast. Why would they be interested in seashells? Well, first of all, they were interested in a particular seashell. It's this purplish seashell that I'm showing you here. It's a very hard seashell. It's not a brittle seashell, a thin shell. It's a very hard shell. And they would polish that shell and drill holes in it, and they would string them together to make wampum belts. And in those wampum belts, they would put various symbols and combinations of seashells to tell stories. People ask, well, did the Native Americans have a written language? Because they are seen as being people who had oral traditions. And yes, they had oral traditions. And I found that many of their stories that are told are just as accurate as the written record. But they use wampum belts to help guide those stories. On the wampum belts, they would put designs, just like the very first one I showed you that showed in purple and white, it showed the Confederation and how those nations, the 5 nations, were linked together. So the clan mothers and the chiefs can read these wampum belts. So it takes a lot of effort to make them, a lot of resources, in terms of gathering these seashells. And then on those belts, it explains their story. If you know how to read the wampum belts and what the symbols represent, it tells the story. And that wasn't just for the Iroquois and just for the Tuscarora. It was for really all Indian nations. All of them valued seashells. And they looked at seashells, pretty much the same way Europeans looked at precious stones looked at gold, silver, diamonds, rubies. Seashells were very important to Native culture and to Native people because you could use it to make wampum belts, and wampum belts were very, very important to Native people. And the Tuscaroras controlling eastern North Carolina and North Carolina control these trade routes to the coast to trade these seashells with other nations to the west, and of course, as I said before, their kinsmen to the north. So roads like 64 that goes east from Raleigh to all the way to Nag's Head, but out to the coast. 264 that goes through Greenville and through Wilson, but eventually also goes to the coast, up to Roanoke Island. 70, which goes up, from southeast North Carolina. So all of these roads, these east-west roads, 158, which runs from eastern North Carolina right across paralleling 58 in Virginia down into Greensboro, and then picks up 421 and goes on to Winston-Salem, and then up through the mountains into Tennessee and towards the Cumberland Gap. All of these state highways, with the exception of 95, but 95 is running along what would have been US 1. All of these highways were Native American trading paths. And when the Europeans came, all they really did was they dug ditches and they widened the roads so that they could handle wagon traffic. And they, dug ditches to drain the roads so that you could travel on them year round. And then later they were paved. And so now we see them as highways and roads, but all of them with Native American trading paths prior to that and prior to the Europeans arriving. And so in that way, the Tuscaroras have access to trading with their kinsmen in the north and with other Indian nations in the west. This is the Great Warrior Path running down through the mountains of Virginia. It was called the Seneca Road, and then it was called the Great Warrior Path. It later became known as the Wagon Road. And the Senecas and Mohawks and Cayugas came down from New York State on that through the Shenandoah Valley down into the Tennessee Valley to wage war against the Cherokees and to also trade with the Tuscaroras that were in North Carolina. So just important to understand that road today is Interstate 81 and 11, and it still runs through the Appalachian Valley from New York down through Pennsylvania, down to Tennessee, all the way down to North Georgia and North Alabama. This is a map of the Tuscarora homeland just prior to the start of the Tuscarora War. It shows major Tuscarora villages in Bertie County, along the Roanoke River, along the Tar River, the Neuse River. It shows Chief Blunt's village near Tarboro, and then his people were moved to Indian Woods. There were already Tuscarora people living in Bertie County and in Indian Woods, but after the war, those Tuscaroras that stayed in North Carolina all were sent to Bertie County and ended up living in Indian Woods. You also see Hancockstown near Chetnea Creek, down near Greene in Greene County. But you see the major areas where there were major Tuscarora settlements in eastern North Carolina. But as I pointed out, the hunting grounds they had would go between the Neuse River and the Cape Fear River and would go as far west as Raleigh and even into Greensboro in terms of their hunting and definitely their trading with other Indian nations to the west. Now, I'm going to try to talk about and touch on a little bit about the impact of Europeans. So I'm trying to give you an overview of Native people in North America and in North Carolina prior to the arrival of Europeans. And now I'm going to talk about the arrival of Europeans, the first being the Spanish. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Spanish invasion. Now, I'll warn the viewers that in this section, there will be a few images that are graphic in nature, but they were recorded by the Spanish in Spanish conquistadors and in their campaigns against the native people in North Carolina. And I don't know that many people realize that they were native people in Virginia as well, and that these campaigns were conducted against the Powhatans and the Indians of Virginia. So we'll touch on that in this talk, this part of the presentation. I often tell people just think about the fact that the Spanish, they arrived in the Americas first. They interacted with the native people in the Caribbean, spreading disease, really kidnapping tens of thousands of Native American women and children, particularly women that they took back to Europe and they used as concubines and as sex slaves. And then they continued to exploit not just the Caribbean. Once they conquered the Caribbean Indians, they used the Caribbean as a launching pad for their invasions into North America, Central America, and South America. So through disease and warfare, spreading influenza, smallpox, chickenpox, mumps, rubella, all kinds of diseases, they devastated native populations throughout Central America, South America, and Mexico, and were successful in really conquering the entire area and converting the Indians to Catholicism. But as you notice with this map, what we call the Northeastern Indians, which starts in North Carolina along the Cape Fear River, there is less of an impact on the Northeastern Indians. And one of the reasons for that is that the Northeastern Indians, they were confederated. As I've told you before, they were a democracy, and they were a democracy based on kinship. And the Tuscaroras, Mohawks, Onondagas, Oneidas, Cayugas, Senecas, they were all considered kin. And you wouldn't harm your brother, you wouldn't harm your sister. Most of us would not. I think majority of people would not. That is how they viewed each other. No matter if it was one or if it was 10,000. One Tuscarora, all of them are Tuscaroras, and Tuscaroras look after Tuscaroras. You know, in fact, the great law taught that Iroquois don't kill Iroquois, that they are united, and that's the greatest sin is for one to turn against the other. And through their unity and through their alliance, they were successful in maintaining their sovereignty and controlling their territory. If we talk about this map and what is represented and what happened in the other parts of the Americas, one of the things we see in Central America and South America is there were natives like the Aztecs who were exploited other natives. I mean, they did rule them. They conquered other Native Americans and they did exploit those Native Americans. And so other Native nations hated the Aztecs, and they hated the Incas. And so when the Spanish came in, basically promising to liberate them from the Aztecs, they joined the Spanish. They would not have been able to succeed without the aid of Indians who had been exploited by these powerful Indians, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, and then they basically helped them to destroy those natives. But then once those natives were destroyed, the Spanish basically destroyed them. And that was unexpected. I mean, they didn't expect the Spanish to be, in some cases, worse in terms of their treatment of them than their Indians that they did not get along with and they were in conflict with. This is a Spanish map that was drawn to show, those areas that they explored. They knew a lot about Florida, a lot about South Carolina, Georgia, a lot about Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, all the way over into California. So the notion, that Europeans didn't know about Native people, they were very familiar with their major towns, their leaders, their chiefs, their trade routes, the river systems. They were very familiar. And they, had begun to try to, exploit them and to Christianize them. And they did make efforts, and we're going to touch on that in the next slide, to try to do the very same thing in North Carolina and Virginia and further north, but they were unsuccessful because of these alliances between the Iroquois and then the Algonquin people that were in Virginia and North Carolina. So if we talk about the Spanish and we talk about their slave raids along the coast of North Carolina, Virginia, and throughout the Americas, and then we talk about conquistadors and explorers like De Soto and Pardo, who go into the western part of North Carolina and even coastal areas in an effort to try to exploit and colonize the Indians in North Carolina and Virginia, they fail. And they fail because these Indians remain united and they don't see the divisions and the fissures that they saw in Central America, Latin America, because these Indians, as I said before, tended to have democracies and tended to treat each other a little bit better in terms of their alliances. The Northeastern Indians did. So there's a divide between Northeastern Indians and Southeastern Indians, but the Northeastern Indians were much harder to penetrate during this period. They made an effort in 1570. The Spanish did build a mission in the Chesapeake, basically in the same location as what became Jamestown in 1607. They had kidnapped the son of a chief years before, taken him to Mexico City, educated him, Christianized him, made him a Catholic, taught him their language, brought him back to install him as chief. And during that period of installation, there was a conflict that arose. And so what happened is that the Algonquin-speaking people, the Powhatans, that they believed in polygamy. And so the chief was expected to have more than one wife. But the Spanish, of course, frowned on that. They, you had one wife, they thought that was not, Christian. And so a conflict arose between the priest and this new leader of the Powhatans, which led to the priest chastising him in front of his people and humiliating him in front of his people. And his people, of course, were looking upon him to see how he would react. And so to save face with his people, he basically kills the priest and burns the churches in Virginia. And that will lead to the Spanish returning. Once they find that the church has been destroyed, that the priests have been killed, then the Spanish will go sweep throughout the region, murdering and killing and burning native villages and killing Native Americans in revenge for the killing of those priests, because that, according to them, was the worst thing you could do, is to kill a priest. So these drawings are from that period. Bartholomew, who accompanied the Spanish conquistadors on their campaigns in North America, North Carolina, Virginia, and also in Latin America, documents their cruelties against the Native Americans. And as I said before, I'll move through these quickly. But again, you can see the villages, you can see the Iroquois longhouses or the longhouses in the region, and you can also see the Spaniards attacking those longhouses, burning the houses, seizing goods and property, killing the chiefs. But you see them basically, assaulting the native people in those areas during that particular time period. Here you see them having killed women and men, and then about to kill the child there as well. We see them also burning people alive, all in efforts to intimidate, to punish, and to instill fear in the natives so that they could be able to colonize them the way in which they colonized native people in the Caribbean and in Central America, using their war dogs to assault them and to attack them during their campaigns in this particular region. I usually pause on this particular illustration because I did research in the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which is one of the largest collections of Native American history and culture in the United States. And they have a lot of materials on early Native American history and culture. And there's a collection of oral histories, one set from 1918, the other set from the 1930s. And it's of Tuscaroras who gave oral recordings of stories that had been passed down to them from generation to generation to generation, and were told to never forget. And one of those stories, when I read those stories and copied them, one was about the handless maiden. And at the time when I read the story, I just thought it was, maybe a metaphor, that it was, it wasn't real. It was just something that they were telling the kids to try to scare the kids into behaving well and to teach a moral lesson. But then when I found these drawings by Bartholomew, and you can clearly see in these illustrations that the Spanish were chopping the hands and the feet off of Native Americans, it hit me that that story was based in reality and based in fact. And so it's important to understand that these things were done to try to intimidate the Native Americans in the region, in Virginia and the Carolinas. But all it really did is force the Algonquin-speaking people into military alliances with the Iroquois, with the Tuscaroras, and they created more powerful alliances. So groups like the Saponis and the Tutelos, who were in Western Virginia and the western part of North Carolina, they end up coming into greater alliance with the Tuscaroras, who were in the region, because they unite themselves against the Spanish in the 1560s and 1567, 68, and then in 1570 in Virginia. You just really see, one, the displacement of Algonquins from the Chesapeake Bay area, pushing them further south into North Carolina. And then you also see these other Indians starting to fall into confederation with the Tuscaroras during that particular time period. So we have the Spanish in the 1560s and 1570s, and they've had this impact on Native Americans in Virginia and North Carolina. Now we are going to go to the English. So I'm just giving you overviews of what's happening with Carolina Indians so that you have a better understanding of how these groups are connected. and how they're related. So in 1584, what we see is that the English will send an expedition to North Carolina. They arrive in the Outer Banks region, a treacherous region, as these illustrations show. Many of the English ships, basically ran aground in the sandbars and shallow waters leading up to the Outer Banks, and then trying to get through the inlets in the Outer Banks, which was again a great natural barrier for the native people who end up in eastern North Carolina, because again it was treacherous for ships to get into the area. And so it really helped the North Carolina Indians, the coastal Indians, and the Tuscarora for many generations to keep from being exploited by the Europeans. But we see the English make their way in. They map the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They map Roanoke Island. They map the Indian nations in what we call the Albemarle region, that area north of the Albemarle Sound, but south of the Chesapeake, the Chowan River, the Roanoke River, and they map the different Indian towns, the Indian peoples, the Indian villages in eastern North Carolina. And on this map, and I'll see if my cursor will allow you, if you can see my cursor, and you see here I say Monogox or Tuscarora. If you look at the map here and you see Albemarle Sound is here, the Chowan River here running into the Meharon and Nottoway rivers, the Roanoke River is here. You see the town of Moratuck here. Moratuck is basically in what today we call Indian Woods in Bertie County, which became the Tuscarora Reservation in 1717. So it's been recorded in history since the 1580s. So it is a very old settlement, a very old region. But then if you go south of there, following my cursor here with Moratuck right here, if you go south of there, then you see Monogox right here. So the Monogox were Tuscaroras. And the reason why they're small, even though they dominated everything in the backcountry from the Meharon and Nottoway rivers all the way down to the Cape Fear River, the reason why they were small is because the English didn't know anything about them. And when the English attempted to go into their territory and they went up to Moratuck to try to map the villages and map the area, the Tuscaroras attacked them on the Roanoke River and drove them back out to Roanoke Island. So they put it small because they knew very little about the Tuscaroras, the Monogox, but the Monogox were the most powerful Indian group in North Carolina. And of course, they were in alliance with the Algonquins in the east, because they went to the Outer Banks all the time to gather seashells and to trade. And obviously they're in force all throughout North Carolina. So the coastal Indians would not have challenged the Tuscaroras during this particular time period. Okay, so just looking at the historic map, showing all the Indian nations, and naming them and showing their villages and their chief men, and the chiefs. And then this is a modern version of that map, where the Tuscaroras are in the western part. They're really at the mouths of all of the major rivers, the Chowan, the Tar, the Neuse, the Cape Fear. And then these Indians in the east, like the Machapunga, Bear River, Mattamuskeet, these Indians basically are in confederation with the Tuscaroras because of the impact that the Spanish had on them. And then, just again, they remain in and stay in alliance in that period after the English come. Other thing to remember about the English, these are all drawings from the English in eastern North Carolina. We've seen this before. We saw this with the Spanish. We've seen it with the French. Different Native Americans had different style housing. They didn't all live in the same types of structures. Out on the Western Plains, the Apaches and the Navajos and whatnot, they used teepees. And in different groups in the East, they had different styled housing. The Catawba's houses were different than the houses of the Iroquois. So these are, examples of Iroquois longhouses. So we know that there was interaction with the Iroquois during this time period. And even the structure of their villages is very similar to the structure, the same structure as the Mohawk villages up in New York State during the same time period. Again, these are all drawings from North Carolina, showing them in dugout canoes, fishing, showing their villages, their gardens, corn, beans, squash, tobacco, but showing how they were living during that particular time period. But it's important to understand that when the English came, Spanish had done the same thing, but when the English came, the English spread disease. They spread disease, war, and death all throughout eastern North Carolina from 1584 to 1587. Wherever the English went, and they were mapping the Algonquin villages that were along the coast of North Carolina and along the swamps, the Alligator Swamp, and along the Albemarle region up and around those tributaries that led up to the Great Dismal. Everywhere they went, they spread disease. And whole villages began to die. Men, women, and children, the old, the young, everybody began to die after they had, made contact with them. So when they came to Moratuck, along the Roanoke River, which was a Tuscarora village, Tuscarora stronghold, the Tuscaroras attacked them. They would not let them get out and come anywhere near their people. So they attacked them while they were in the river. And they fled, from the Roanoke River and from Moratuck. They fled back out to Roanoke Island. And the Tuscaroras have another legend. I talk about these legends and these oral traditions I found in the Philosophical Society. But the Coons manuscript, which is a collection of stories from Tuscaroras, they say that, not only did they drive the English back out to Roanoke Island when they tried to come to their villages and map their villages and make contact with them in Bertie County, that they pursued them out to the island, and that they actually were the ones who destroyed the lost colony. Now, I know down in Hatteras Island, for those who might be listening who know the Hatteras Indians down on Hatteras Island, they are finding some Elizabethan artifacts down there as well. But we're also finding them up in Bertie County at Site X and Site Y, which is marked in the red there on this map. The Tuscaroras explained that very clearly as well. They said that they pursued the whites out to the island. When they left the whites on the island, they attacked the island. They killed the people that resisted, but they found several of the people had blonde hair or red hair, and they'd never seen people with blonde hair or red hair before. And so they were afraid to kill them because they thought they were children of the sun. And if they killed them, that would be, that would be an evil omen for them. And they didn't want them to live with them. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. They didn't want them in their villages. So they said they put those people in a canoe. It's about 4 of them. They put them in canoes, and they sent them south. They floated them south down towards Hatteras Island. And so it is very, possible that the colonists were split into 2 groups. And that is what the archaeological evidence seems to be indicating, that yes, that these artifacts being found in Bertie County at the 2 sites that are being excavated in Bertie County are clearly from that time period. And we are pretty sure they are related to them. But then the people are finding artifacts down in Hatteras Island. I don't see a conflict in the 2 finds, because again, if you know the Tuscarora legend and story about what took place, then you understand that there were 2 sets of colonists, and there was a reason why the Tuscaroras didn't take them all, because they didn't want those people who had red hair and blonde hair that they'd not seen before. They did not want them in their villages. This is just a map of eastern North Carolina in the pink with Roanoke Island, the Outer Banks, and those who do genealogy, make sure you understand that when you're looking at the colonial period in early North Carolina, that early North Carolina is called Virginia. I got it highlighted in green there, but from the Cape Fear region northward, that's all considered Virginia. And when they went to Jamestown and were successful in the settlement at Jamestown, then that area became known as Old Virginia. And then Jamestown became New Virginia. So you just need to understand, when you're looking at old maps and old documents, you need to understand, that that's what we're talking about. So I'm going to kind of try to wind this down with this last piece. So I've told you about Native people and how they interacted, their alliances, their culture, who they are. I've told you about the Europeans. We have the Spanish wave and then the English wave, how that it infects the people with disease and depopulates them in the region. Now I'm going to talk about Africans and the introduction of Africans and the impact that Africans, Native Americans, Europeans, in terms of, cultural merging and blending or creolization that happens between 1586 and 1587. I'm sorry, 1586 and 1711. That's the last section I'm going to touch on and talk about as I kind of wrap up this presentation. So if we talk about that and we look at, racial and cultural mixing, it happened throughout the Americas. The Spanish were the first to do it. The Spanish came into the Americas, and they immediately began to have relationships with Native American women. They began to take Native American women and they took them back to Spain and back to Portugal. and they basically interacted with people. And then later, they began to bring and import large numbers of Africans into the region. So you have Spaniards, you have Portuguese, you have Africans being brought into the New World, and all of them start to intermix and blend together, creating a creolized people throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America and Florida, places like Texas, but all throughout Central and South America. So you have these different mixes. You got mix of Indian and black. You got mixes of Indian, black, and white. You got mix of Indian and white, mix of black and white. You have all these different mixes that are going to happen as a result of the Spanish. Same thing will happen with the English later in North America, and we'll talk about that because what many people don't know, I doubt if many of your viewers know, everyone talks about the lost colony in North Carolina. So most people know that there were 100 and some whites that were left on Roanoke Island in 1587, and then they disappeared. And I just explained to you what the Tuscaroras say happened to those people. But what most people don't know is that a year before that, in 1586, Sir Francis Drake arrived from England with a fleet of ships that had over 600 West African Moors and Maroons who were helping him in the Caribbean to attack Spanish islands and seize gold and silver and galleons and attacking settlements. That as he attacked locations, he told local enslaved people who were Africans, in some cases Indians, or a mix of African and Indians. They were Moors, they were Muslims, they were West Indians. These people, he promised them their freedom if they would fight for England. And what this map shows, if you follow my cursor again, it shows there was a fleet of ships that left England, went along the coast of Africa. Here's the fleet, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, attacked islands in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Cuba, smaller islands throughout the Caribbean and Florida, seizing gold and silver and building an army that ultimately ended up being over 600 West African Moors, Maroons, but these runaway slaves and other peoples that they had acquired who hated the Spanish and were helping them to attack and burn and destroy Spanish settlements and Spanish ships. And then he promised to give them their freedom. So he went up to North Carolina to resupply and check on that settlement, which again, remember the settlement started in 1584-85. The explorers were exploring in 1584 and 85. They were attacked by the Tuscaroras on the Roanoke River in 1585 and fled back out to the island. And then over the course of that, going back to the island in 1586, Drake comes back from England with these 600, comes out of his campaigns in the Caribbean with these 600 soldiers, African and mixed soldiers, and he releases them on Roanoke Island, picks up these explorers who were fearing another attack by the Tuscaroras, and he flees back to England, and you see the fleet arriving back in England here, coming across the North Atlantic and going back into England here. So what happened to these people? What happened to 600 Maroons? Maroons are people who live in the swamps and in the mountains of the Caribbean, who have no concern about mosquitoes and snakes and whatnot. And if you saw the earlier maps of Eastern North Carolina, much of Eastern North Carolina, the Alligator Swamp, the Great Dismal Swamp, most of that area is nothing but big swamp. And when the whites came, because they were dropped off in 1586, when the white colonists came in 1587, they didn't find anybody there. So where did all these 600 people go? They were well armed with guns. They came onto the island. They had been fighting in the Caribbean and fighting in the swamps against the Spanish. Again, no one has ever tried to fully understand what happened to those people, but it's pretty clear that those people, they would have been resistant to European diseases. It's clear that they intermerged and mixed with the coastal Indians in and around that region. And we see that when we start looking at, again, these later groups of Indians that were not on the original maps that were drawn by John White and Ralph Lane from 1584 to 85. So we can see that these mixtures started to occur. And if you start talking to people down in Hyde County, you'll have Africans, Americans down there who are of mixed heritage, and they'll tell you that people were always there. and they're of Indian and African ancestry and heritage. So it's important for us to understand that here in North Carolina, when we talk about 1619 and the 1619 project in Virginia, and blacks being brought as indentured servants and then later slaves in Virginia, that there were free blacks in North Carolina who had been left in North Carolina, who intermixed and merged with native populations in eastern North Carolina, but that most of the early blacks that came into North Carolina, which was at least 30 years, 37, 33 years before they were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, these people are functioning and living as maroons in the swamps of eastern North Carolina. And we know that by the time of the Tuscarora War in 1711, all of those coastal Indians were in confederation with the Tuscarora, and they fight during the Tuscarora War on the side of the Tuscarora against the whites that were there. So I've already talked about the lost colony and the destruction of the lost colony. I've already talked about the Tuscarora saying they took the colonists and they brought them back to Bertie County, except for those that had red hair and blonde hair. They put them in a canoe and sent them south. And I already talked about, therefore, the early mixing because of the reduction of the coastal Indians by disease. They were mixing with both whites and blacks that were brought in, and that would really help the Tuscaroras and some of those coastal Indians to become more resistant to diseases, because the Europeans, of course, Africans in particular, had already been exposed to smallpox and influenza, all of those European diseases. And so intermixing with Africans and intermixing with whites actually strengthened Indians' resistance to European diseases. And so you have a lot of those Indians in eastern North Carolina who are able to, to do fairly well during that time period in terms of resisting native, these European diseases that are brought. And certainly we see creolization of people in eastern North Carolina because of this during that period. So a lot of eastern North Carolina native people, black people, white people, end up being creolized during that time period. And you'll have mulattoes, people who are black and white. You'll have mestizos, people who are Indian and white. You have black Indians. You'll have triracials, we call them triracial isolates, people who are Indian, black, and white. African Americans, well, not, again, depending on where you settle. If you settle with Indians, you're Indian, no matter how dark you are or how light you are. You're not white, you're not black, you're Indian, because your mother was Indian, you're Indian. But we have people that we will call triracial. You'll see in that region, Freemans, even today, a lot of the Freemans, and there are certain families that have native African mix, and they will have green eyes, blue eyes, or gray eyes. They could be dark skinned. There's some bonds in my family. One of my mother's first cousins was very, very dark skinned, but he had blue eyes. Africans did not have blue eyes, nor did Native Americans. That clearly indicates a racial mixing between the groups during that particular time period. This is just showing the migration in North Carolina down from Virginia, moving throughout eastern North Carolina during that time period, or in the period following the Tuscarora War. After they defeat the Tuscaroras, people basically migrating down and moving down into that area. And this is just another illustration of the different groups of Indians that would have been in Virginia and North Carolina: Nottaways, Meharans, Tuscaroras, Choanooks, Chesapeake, Nesman. But a lot of these Indians end up getting displaced, and they end up moving west, and they end up being, once they're forced out of their homelands, they're going to be kind of migrating and moving around. And remember those campaigns by the Spanish, anybody who's living along one of those major rivers in the Chesapeake that the Spanish can get to, they're burning those villages, they're killing the people, and they were taking them in the 1570s and 60s. And so they're moving down into northeastern North Carolina, to just for safety, And so, but all of these nations, including the Neuse Indians and the Core Indians, which, as you see down there near the Neuse River, coming up on Hatteras Island, all of these Indians, they are, those are both Algonquin speaking groups, but these Indians end up being confederated, and they certainly are confederated during the time of the Tuscarora War. Even as far north as the Mattaponi and the Pamunkeys during the Tuscarora War, they are, supporting and confederating with the Iroquois, and the Virginians are trying to keep them out of the war. and not to support the Five Nations and the Tuscaroras during the Tuscarora War. I'm going to wind it down here. We know that the whites failed to settle eastern North Carolina. We know that they end up moving to Virginia, and they are successful in establishing a foothold in Jamestown. And from that foothold in Jamestown, they will expand south down into northeastern North Carolina, and of course, southeastern Virginia. And I put this up to say two more things as I close out this talk. So I've done enough, I hope, to kind of explain history and culture of Native people in North Carolina and Virginia. I've explained how they would come to be blending culturally and even by blood. And the last piece I want to explain is how that is continued during the period before the Tuscarora War, after they failed to colonize North Carolina. So they failed North Carolina. They failed absolutely in North Carolina. But they do introduce whites into North Carolina, and they introduce Africans. And those Africans and those whites end up intermixing with the Indian population, the coastal Indian population, and the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina. That mixing continues in the 1600s because when the English established Virginia in 1607 and bring the first large number of African indentured servants in 1619, between 1619 and let's say the 1670s, certainly by the 1680s, the initial people, it was just indentured servitude. So many of the first Africans that were brought to Virginia, once they finished their servitude, which was for 4 to 7 years, they became free people, and they could buy land, they could have their own indentured servants, they could grow tobacco, and they could trade, and they could prosper. So many Africans who had been indentured servants in 1619, they were prosperous and doing well after that period. By the time we get into the 1660s, 1670s, and by the 1680s is when the law starts to change. And so Virginia then decides that they're going to move to race-based slavery. And so they begin to change the law. And they have specific laws. And it's interesting when you look at the laws. They pass laws that specifically say if that you are a descendant of a Moor, of a Muslim, of a West African, or an Indian, then you're going to be a slave and be a slave for the rest of your natural life. So they are very specific in the language, in the law, which acknowledges the fact that there were Moors and there were Muslims and there were these West Africans in the region, in Virginia. Remember, Virginia is northeastern North Carolina, that they're in this region. And so they're saying if you have any African blood or Indian blood, then you're going to be a slave, and you're going to be a slave for the rest of your natural life. So all of these people who were of mixed heritage, Indian and Black and Indian and white, who had lived out their servitude in Virginia, they began to move down into northeastern North Carolina, and they began to move down along the Roanoke River, in the Chuan River in Bertie County, and they began to settle with and continue to intermix with the Tuscaroras who were already there. Okay, Tuscaroras did not care about that, but they were starting to create a race-based slave system. And so anyone who had a mixture, they were subject to be enslaved. So people left the Virginia settlement and moved to the frontier to live with the Indians. And so we see a lot of people moving down and intermixing with the already mixed Indian, Black, white people in eastern North Carolina, in the Alligator Swamp and in the Great Dismal Swamp. We see more people moving down into that region and intermixing with and trading with the Tuscaroras during that time period. One example is during the Tuscarora War, and the relations between Africans and Indians and during this time was positive because Africans were being enslaved just like Indians were being enslaved, and so they tended to have positive relationships. And during the Tuscarora War, the colony banned all trade in weapons to the Tuscaroras. You could not trade them guns, gunpowder, lead, but the Black traders brought them guns and gunpowder and lead anyway. They violated that colonial law and brought them these goods anyway. So it's important to understand that the relationship in the colonial period between Africans and Indians was a very different relationship throughout the colonial, and even I would say as late as the early antebellum or late colonial period, there was a very different relationship between these groups. And I'll give you an example of that as well. So this is where I'm gonna start to pause out, because this is the Chesapeake of Virginia. You see the Monogoks and you see the other Indian groups in North Carolina and Virginia. We already have talked about, the Monogoks being Tuscaroras. They're shown on the maps in the 1600s during this period. This is a map from 1606 showing the Monogoks, which are the Tuscaroras in in North Carolina. I also highlighted, the Virginia, the fact that they still consider this to be Virginia. A whole series. Here's another map from 1630, still showing the Monogoks, who are Tuscaroras in the backcountry of Virginia. So well documented. This well documented, even as more and more whites are coming into Virginia and North Carolina and settling or attempting to settle Virginia and North Carolina in what became the Albemarle County and the Albemarle region, which included Bertie County, which was part of the first county in North Carolina. And then we see several other counties being established in the coastal areas. And even as those counties are being established, there are still native peoples in the Great Alligator Swamp, Great Dismal Swamp, still in and around the Neuse and Tar rivers near what became New Bern. There's still native people and mixed cultures in those areas during that time period between 1663 and 1729. And then we start having an influx of Africans starting to come in. I will say one other thing, and then I'm really going to be done. I did want to say, that prior to the acceleration of the African slave trade and large numbers of Africans being brought to Virginia and North Carolina, in North Carolina, slavery was not legal. Slavery wasn't legalized until 1715. Which is 2 years after the end of the Tuscarora War. It ended in 1713. The interesting thing about the ending of the Tuscarora War and the legalization of slavery in North Carolina is that we know that roughly during the Tuscarora War, about a third of the Tuscarora was slaughtered in the war. A third of the Tuscaroras were enslaved in the war and shipped as far as the British Caribbean, as far away as the British Caribbean, but throughout South Carolina, North Carolina. Barnwell took hundreds down to South Carolina after the first battle. Moore did the same. So we have all of these, Indians who end up being enslaved in North Carolina after the Tuscarora War. And so if you look at the slave population before the Tuscarora War and before 1715, the population doubles, it triples in 1715 when they legalize it in North Carolina. And many of those early slaves are Indian slaves, and they are Tuscaroras who have been enslaved in Eastern North Carolina. So the foundations of early North Carolina slavery in the 1700s after 1715 is really going to be native slavery, Native American slaves, and then they're going to be layered on top of by African slaves who are being imported from West Africa during this particular time period. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'll be open for a question or two.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Smallwood, for that history lesson. I mean, that was, I got my grandson here trying to hog the screen here. That was very good information. You spoke about the Moors being here, and that also speaks to the Moore-Sundry Act in South Carolina. Hold on, buddy. You see I'm on a call. Yeah, the Moore-Sundry Act in South Carolina, which also proves that they were here. And I think also sharing that brings to light about the admixtures that I speak about quite frequently. There was an article, there's actually a paper that came out. I think it was, I can't remember I can't remember the name of the article, and it was speaking about racism in Indian country. You have, because everybody's into full blood, and if you're not a full blood, who's on first and who's on second? I think from your presentation, you're showing people west of the Mississippi that regardless of how people look, following the matrilineal line, it doesn't matter how you look if you came through the mother. You're an Indian, especially if you identify as that. A lot of our families here in North Carolina, they know that they have these mixtures. Some of them identify as Indian, some of them don't. I have an elder down in Freeman Beach actually speaking about this. He said, yeah, we know we're Indian, but we identify as African American, He said, but they call us Negroes. So, I mean, they know the whole story, but families pick and choose how they want to identify. If you identify as an Indian, but you don't fit the narrative of what Indian is supposed to look at, your presentation is helping people understand that we shouldn't go off of looks. We should go off of family, bloodline. You were sharing how all the Iroquois are related, they're family. And I want the audience to understand you have a unique perspective because your family is from Indian Woods and your family is buried there. So you're not some outsider who took some courses and now you want to teach about American Indian history. You actually have family who is from Indian Woods, Tuscarora Reservation. So I just want to throw that out there, and I appreciate you sharing that information. So we have a few questions. You've already answered some of the questions in your presentation, so we took some of those questions out. So Blue Feather, I'll turn it over to you so you can ask a few questions we have.
Yes, sir. And thank you, Chief. And thank you, Dr. Smallwood. That article that Chief was just referencing is an article by Russell Contreras. It's called Cherokee Nation Wants Federal Law Fix for Black Tribal Citizens. And it was very interesting, as he mentioned, in case you want to check that out. But let's go ahead and get into a quick Q&A. Our first question is, you mentioned a little bit about the different eye color and some of the phenotypes. Can you explain the Tuscarora eye?
Okay, so because the Tuscaroras say they absorbed the lost colony, and we know that the English in 1584, 85 did row up the Roanoke River, did explore, and were attacked at Moratuck, which is basically near what is today Williamston. They would have been on the south side, in and near Williamston, and the Tuscaroras would have been on the north side of the river. And then once they were attacked, the Tuscaroras say they pursued them, which again is what you would think in terms of military strategy. If someone probes you or probes your position, you tend not to let those people go because you are anticipating that they're going to, probably attack you again. And so what we see happening is that the Tuscaroras say that they pursued them to the island, and then they killed people that resisted, and they took the women and children and the others who they could, take back to their area. Well, by intermixing with those colonists, those European colonists, you're going to start introducing European characteristics into the Tuscarora Nation, and they're being introduced on a really grand scale because I just explained about those clans. The one thing, there are 7 clans that we know of during recorded times, and there could have been 2 or 3 more, but we know there were 7 clans at the time of contact with the, at the time of the Tuscarora War. You can't marry someone in your clan. So you have to marry outside of your clan. So a deer can marry a bear, but a deer can't marry a deer. So when you start absorbing large numbers, these Europeans, when they were absorbed into one clan or more than one clan, then very quickly they would have the blood would have been mixed throughout the Tuscarora people in the Tuscarora Nation. And as a result of that blood mixture, some of the characteristics that began to be seen and well recorded in the colonial records is that Tuscaroras had blue eyes, they had green eyes, they had gray eyes, gray or white, we call it hazel eyes, that some had like reddish auburn hair, and that's still in families today. And the Freemans still have those eyes. In our community, Rascals and Bonds, and even some of the Smallwoods have what we call the Tuscarora eye. But then also this reddish hair. It's like reddish brown hair. So red, brown, auburn hair. And then in the case of the Tuscarora, some people ended up with blonde hair. So it doesn't take long when you got 7 clans and several are mixing with whites within 2 generations, within a generation, 1 generation, definitely by 2, pretty much all of the Tuscaroras had some members that had mixtures and were coming out with these characteristics. And I've interacted with groups of people who, who have demonstrated their Tuscarora ancestry. And Freemans, when we talk about that, Freemans, like almost everywhere I go with Freemans, a lot of them tend to have that characteristic. But there are certain families that tend to have Williams, that tend to have, and it can be mixed through different families, but there are certain families that have that mixture. So the bottom line with the Tuscarora eye is that it came into the Tuscarora Nation from them absorbing, they say, the whites from the lost colony. And remember, this is happening in 1586. So by the time we get to the Tuscarora War in 1711, I mean, 100 years, more than 100 years has passed. And so these Tuscaroras are thoroughly mixed with Europeans and have, obviously they're native, but they have European characteristics. And then they have also mixed with Africans. So they have a mix, they have a mixture. And so, but that eye is prevalent. You don't see it very often among the Mohawks, among the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas. You don't see it with the other 5 nations. You don't see it often with some of the other Indians around them, like the Powhatans. But you see it very heavily with the Tuscaroras. That was just one of the characteristics that that they had because of their mixing with these people, with the colonists.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood. Chief and I can certainly attest to having that phenotype in our family line. We have a long list of cousins and even grandparents that we can point to and point out those traits and characteristics. So thank you for explaining that further. The next question is, when most often when people reference Native Americans having a long journey of suffrage, they reference the Trail of Tears. Can you speak on the Tuscarora Trail of Death and tell us why it was called the Tuscarora Death Trail? And if you can even give a physical reference as to where that is, so we can also have that in mind. It may be a mention of Highway 87, if that has any relation, but any information you can provide on that.
Okay, so this is a good map to have on to talk about that. So the Tuscarora Trail or Death Trail is connected to the Tuscarora War and the refugees that were fleeing North Carolina after the war. As you heard me say already, roughly a third of the Tuscarora were killed and slaughtered in the war. At Fort Neoroka in Snow Hill, there were over 900 men, women, and children that were killed and burned alive in Fort Neoroka. And it's still the largest mass grave of Native Americans really anywhere in North America, even larger than Wounded Knee. So we don't think about that, but here in North Carolina, east of the Mississippi River, that is one of the things that comes out of this conflict. And but after that war, what the Tuscaroras were fleeing North Carolina, and they were moving into Virginia, and from Virginia they were moving back up to New York and to Pennsylvania. So to make this not too long, many of the Tuscaroras who fled Snow Hill, eastern North Carolina, they are kind of following Chetnia Creek up and eventually cross over to the Roanoke River and follow the Roanoke River up to Occoneechee Island. And they use Occoneechee Island as kind of a resting point to cross over the Roanoke River, and the Saponis that are there, the Occoneechees that are there, they basically shelter those Tuscaroras who are fleeing eastern North Carolina after the Tuscarora War. And then from Occoneechee Island, once they get north of the Roanoke River, they follow the Roanoke River up to its source in Roanoke, Virginia. And there's a Tuscarora village on the old maps right outside of what is now Roanoke, Virginia, right just on the eastern side of the mountains, just before you go through the gap, the Roanoke River Gap, to go up into the road into what became Roanoke, Virginia, but into the valley, the Roanoke River Valley. From there, the Roanoke River Valley, you follow the north or south branch, but basically the north branch of the Shenandoah River, because it runs north-south. And so you're avoiding having to cross, rivers and cross the deep part of the river, because, Roanoke Rapids up in that area is more shallow. So you're crossing the river, the shallow point, then you're, going along the river to get up to the mountains. And then from there, you follow the Shenandoah River up into Virginia and over to part of the Appalachian Trail, but it's called the Tuscarora Trail. And up near Harper's Ferry, Virginia, you cross over into Pennsylvania, and then you go through what's called the Tuscarora Mountains. There are Tuscarora villages up there and in Virginia. and then from Pennsylvania through the Tuscarora Mountains, you will curve east and go towards Yorktown, Pennsylvania, and Lackawanna, and then from there you'll turn north and you'll head north up to New York State. So that's the Tuscarora Trail in essence. And it's called the Tuscarora Trail or the Death Trail because after the Tuscarora War, there were wounded people, there were old people, old women, old men, there were pregnant women, who were fleeing North Carolina and trying to make their way north to their kinsmen, the Five Nations. And lots of people died on the trail because it's called the Tuscarora Trail or Death Trail. Now, they had traveled that trail, for many generations, going back to when they first migrated to North Carolina. And every 7 years or so, they would always go back to New York State to fellowship with their kin, the Five Nations, and trade seashells with them. But this time, when they were leaving North Carolina, it's called the Death Trail because so many people, were wounded and injured, and they died on that march out of North Carolina to rejoin their people in New York. And some stopped in Virginia, they stopped in Pennsylvania, and stopped in Maryland and settled and didn't and never really made it all the way to New York. But one of the examples of the people traveling to New York, and this is in the Coombs manuscript, another oral tradition, there was a group of Tuscaroras who had made it all the way to Slide Mountain, New York. And Slide Mountain is an actual place. You can go to Slide Mountain. And they couldn't go any further. This is following the Tuscarora War. There were old women, old men. They just could not go any further. They stopped at Slide Mountain. The local people noticed this foreign group of Indians settling there, so it made it into the newspapers in the local area because they were concerned. And they were even more terrified and concerned when what happened is that runners from the Tuscarora, young men who were runners, were sent to Montreal, to Ganawage, to the Mohawk Reservation in Ganawage, just outside of Montreal, to get the Mohawks to let them know that their people were there and couldn't go any further. And the Mohawks sent warriors down from Ganawage down to Slide Mountain. And the local people know the Mohawks and knew how fierce they were, and they were terrified. And they began to arm themselves and get ready for a war with the Mohawks. And then they were stunned when they saw the Mohawks, as fierce as they were. They picked up the old men and the old women, and they put them on their backs, and they carried them on their backs up to Ganawage, to the Mohawk Reservation at Ganawage. If you go to the Mohawk Chapel, they record these Tuscaroras who converted to Catholicism, to the church, they were baptized at the church. And you can go to the church and you can see where their names are written in the times in the 1700s there, 1714, 1713, 1715, when they were brought into the church there at Ganawage. So that's one of the stories, and it speaks to, number one, how important the Tuscaroras were to the Five Nations and how much they loved the Tuscaroras for them to come down and pick these people up. But it also speaks to, what they went through, the ordeal that they went through. You've lost your loved ones, women and children were kidnapped, sold into slavery, taken after the war, murdered and killed. And to then have, it just shows the shattering of the nation. But I also want to leave on a high note with the nation, and that is, when you think about, I tell people it's like taking a glass or a mirror and you drop it on the floor and it shatters and it scatters all over the floor, and you sweep up the pieces. You can't really put them back together, but you sweep up the pieces. You might be walking, a week later and step on a piece of glass because, you just couldn't get all the pieces. And that's what happened to the Tuscaroras. The Iroquois said they were scattered like smoke in the wind. And they were scattered all over North Carolina, scattered all over Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, but they still, enough of them made it to New York to reconstitute themselves as the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy, the most powerful Indian confederacy in the history of North America. And in 1722, they were officially recognized by the British government as the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. So it is a tragic story, but it also speaks to the Tuscarora people in terms of their influence and power and how beloved they were by the rest of the Five Nations when you really understand that whole story, which is well recorded in the colonial records and in the treaties.
Yes, sir. Thank you. That is a rich history that many people will never hear. So thank you for explaining it so well here. Hopefully lots of people do get that now.
Thank you.
And I
Yes,
like to
sir.
add something. I like to add something real quick. When you speak about the Iroquois being family, I like to say this right here. A lot of tribes lost a lot. They lost languages, lost culture, lost ceremonies, lost dances. The language, like I said, there's an effort. There's an effort now with a lot of indigenous nations trying to uh, revive or relearn the little bit that was left over that was recorded. When it comes to the Tuscarora and the other, all of the Six Nations, that history is intact. And you know, our family here in North Carolina, the history was fragmented because this was war. This is where the war took place. Anywhere you go where you're in a place of war, you know, of course you're going to have a lot of mixed information and fragmentation. But like Dr. Smallwood said, you know, the ones who left and went up there, they took a lot of the, you know, complete history with them, and the kinsmen, the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, and so forth. All of them know the history. They know our history too. So I was just listening to a Mohawk elder speaking about us down here, shh, shh, talking about because of the war, some of us left the coast and went inland, and those and accepted the religion and became Lumbees. Others didn't want to accept the religion and went further down into the swamps. And here you have us. There's a lot of swamps in North Carolina. That's why in York, the land, the wooded swampy land, um, the submerged pine. We're in a swampy land. We went into those swamps because you know that was a place that the colonists didn't like, and didn't really want to deal with the alligators, the snakes, and the mosquitoes, and so forth. So we found refuge in those swamps. The Mohawk elder is speaking about this stuff because he knows our history. Our family knows our history. People can't believe that I can go back to the 1300s on my family's history. We can. And a lot of that is due to because of the mixing. EJ, shh, I was on the phone, buddy. But anyway, Dr. Smallwood, I just want to congratulate you and thank you. And you've done a phenomenal job explaining our history. And like I usually say, even though I'm not speaking about other nations, we're just a snapshot of what happened throughout the East Coast. So when we speak about us, we're indirectly talking about other nations too, because a lot of them experience a lot of the same things. They were, their people were being stolen and enslaved, and you know, a lot of us went into battle for the same reasons because they were killing us, they were stealing us, and you know, all those bad things that we talk about. So thank you so much for sharing that information. I'm not going to be long-winded. I'm gonna turn it back over to you, sis.
Okay, thank you. And we just have one or two more questions. Chief did mention that we're able to go back quite a ways in our lineage to find that information. One of the things that we are curious about, can you speak about the relationship with Hancock and the smaller coastal tribes? Most of those smaller tribes were amalgamated into the Tuscarora, and we want to know if that would be because of Hancock's relationship to them.
I think one of the other important things to remember, I was talking to a group weekend before last, and people talk about Hancock and they talk about Tom Blunt. And oftentimes I think it's forgotten in this dialogue that there were two wars during the Tuscarora War. And the first war was from 1711 to 1712, and the second one from 1712 to 1713. In the first war, all of the Tuscaroras and their allies in the east, the Algonquins, were united. So the Machapunga, the Bear River, the Mattamuskeet, the Core, the Noose, the Pamlico, all of these Indians that were in the swampy areas of eastern North Carolina and coastal areas, all of these Indians were confederated with the Tuscarora during the war, and all of them, you know, waged war in North Carolina, and they were successful. They pretty much had destroyed all of the major settlements, in the unoccupied areas, that were encroaching, New Bern areas where they were encroaching into their territory. You see on this map here down in Southeast. They'd already defeated the Algonquin-speaking people in the Albemarle region in northeast North Carolina, driving the Choanoks across the river into Tuscarora territory and Bertie County area. But they had already kind of controlled. The Indians that were left had been driven into the Great Dismal Swamp. But the areas south of the Albemarle region, they were still pretty much under the control of the Machapungas, the Bear River, the Mattamuskeet, the Core, the Noose, the Hatteras Indians. And these Indians, like I said, were in alliance and maintained it. They were successful. They had defeated the whites. But then they appealed to South Carolina. North Carolinians appealed to South Carolina, who appealed to the Southeastern Indians and asked the Southeastern Indians to come and participate in the war. And so hundreds of Cherokees came down out of the mountains, hundreds of Catawbas, hundreds of Creeks, hundreds of Yamasees came to the aid of the whites, and they destroyed the Tuscaroras in eastern North Carolina and their allies. Two things I'll mention as we move from that. So after being defeated this is in the Second War, but in the First War, they had fought the whites to a standstill, destroyed the white settlements in eastern North Carolina, and Hancock's fort or town, they weren't able to secure it. So they negotiated a peace with him. And when his people, they negotiated the peace, they came out of the fortification, the whites broke the peace treaty and kidnapped his women and children. This was Barnwell, kidnapped his women and children and took them down to South Carolina as slaves. And that's what set off the Second War. But to just be clear, when it came to war, all of the clans had to agree. All of the clan mothers and all of the chiefs held council to talk about what to do next. It was understandable that Hancock was upset because his people had been kidnapped and sold into slavery, but Hancock had signed a treaty with Tom Blunt and 13 other chiefs to be a neutral and not to fight. And the whites, if you look at this map, most of those villages were, near the white settlements, and they had reinforced, and they were under threat of being annihilated by the whites, especially with the combined support of the Indians from the West. So I'm not trying to belabor this and make this long to get to your question. The point I'm making is that I want people to understand that the Tuscaroras were united in the war. They divided in the Second War because they had not held a council to agree on the strategy, and Hancock started to attack, and continue to wage war. And because of the treaty he had signed, the whites threatened to burn and destroy the villages of all the Tuscaroras that were bordering the white settlements. And that's what led to, there being a schism between the chiefs. But to your point about these other coastal Indians, they also refused to stop fighting. So Hancock refused to stop fighting, and the Mattamuskeet, the Machapunga, the Bear River, these other Indians in Hyde County and in the Alligator Swamp area, they refused to stop fighting. And in fact, they continued to fight until 1717 and 1718, burning churches, burning schools, wreaking havoc all throughout eastern North Carolina. And it wasn't until 1718 that they finally surrendered. And then they established Indian Woods, and they put Tom Blunt's and those the other Tuscaroras in Indian Woods, and some of those people there, and they created a reservation for the Machapungas and the Bear River there in the coastal area of North Carolina. But it's just they did not surrender. And if you look at the history of those Indians, the Machapunga, Bear River, Mattamuskeet, they really behaved and had behaved throughout the 1600s, really more like Maroons than anything else. I mean, they would attack ships in the Albemarle Sound. They would, there are shallow points in the Sound. They would wade out into the water. They would attack ships, take women, take children, take all the goods off the ship. I mean, they were wreaking havoc all throughout eastern North Carolina. And the English would ask the Tuscaroras to control them, to stop them from attacking these ships. And the Tuscaroras would say they don't have any control over the Machapunga, Bear River, Mattamuskeet, that they were in sometime alliance with them, but that they would attack their villages and take their women and children. So the point is, there was already mixing between Tuscaroras because of these conflicts, because of alliances, and then they were in strong confederation during the Tuscarora War. And Chief Hancock stayed in strong confederation with those Indians after the war ended, because those Indians refused to surrender. They refused to stop the fight. And so eventually they were defeated. And that gets to the death trail again as well, because even though many Tuscaroras had already left and there were refugees who were going up, from pretty much 1713 until, 17 or 1718, really what caused the mass exodus is that there was, because of these Indians and these conflicts, after the peace was supposed to have been secured, there was a conflict with a white settler that he was wounded, not even killed, just wounded. And then the colonial government of North Carolina called for the complete extermination of Tuscaroras, as if there had never been a peace made with them. And that led to the indiscriminate slaughter and enslavement of Tuscaroras and other natives, but particularly Tuscaroras, throughout eastern North Carolina. And that's when you see lots of Tuscaroras starting to not claim to be Tuscarora. They would say they were Cherokee, or they would, not be native at all. They would be, something else, because again, if you were a Tuscarora, you were hated in eastern North Carolina because you were seen as rebellious and ungovernable. But the Cherokees were loved because they had helped the colonists to defeat the Tuscaroras. And so you just have a different kind of politic happening in this region after the Tuscarora War. So I hope I've answered that. That was a lot to say to answer your question. Hancock and the Indians who were Machapungas, Bear River, Mattamuskeet, these Indians, coastal Indians, they refused to surrender. And they kept fighting even after the Tuscarora War, as late as 1718. They were guerrilla fighters, running and hiding in the swamps and coming out, attacking plantations, attacking schools, attacking courthouses, and then going back into the swamps. And so the area was just in a state of confusion even after the war ended. And I do have to add this last piece, again, getting back to Tom Blunt and Hancock, because yes, Hancock was captured, yes, Hancock was executed, but the Tuscarora War set off a continental Indian war, because the Southeastern Indians had participated in the war and destroyed the Tuscaroras. All of the 5 nations declared war on the Catawbas, the Yamasees, the Creeks, and the Cherokees. And they completely obliterated the Yamasees. And they threatened a war of destruction and extermination against the Cherokees, the Catawbas, and the Creeks, all of whom surrendered to the 5 nations, to the 6 nations. And this was in revenge for what they had done to the Tuscaroras. But Indians killed Indians and killed them for a while. I mean, and Cherokees surrendered. They went to Onondaga, New York, sued for peace. The Creeks surrendered, went to Onondaga, New York, sued for peace. And then the Catawbas were the last to surrender and go to Onondaga and sue for peace. So so it's a lot going on, is what I'm trying to say. So they eventually, a peace is made between all of the Indians, but by that time they have really devastated themselves in these conflicts that have been instigated by the Europeans.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood. That does conclude our Q&A portion. We appreciate everything that you had to say. Thank you again so much. We feel like this is really going to reach a lot of people who needed this information. Chief, did you want to add anything?
No, I really appreciate you sharing the information. I know you do this all the time, and you was able to present it a little differently than some of the others. So, when you look at all of them, you're learning something from each one. So yeah, I really appreciate your presentation and information that you share.
Well, again, thank you
I'll
both.
be talking to you. Yes, sir. And I'll be talking to you soon.
Sounds good. And thank you both again. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for Wide Awake Radio. Take care.